Welcome to the Organic Wine Podcast. Mimi Casteel is Imbibe Magazine's 2020 Wine Person of the Year. She's the vigneron for Hopewell, a certified organic vineyard and a winery in Oregon that she farms regeneratively with animals and birds and all kinds of flora and fauna with no tilling and no fences. Please do yourself a favor and find Mimi's YouTube video about glyphosate. It's a masterclass on soil and vine microbiology and the devastating effect Roundup has on our food and wine. You can find it in a blog post I did at centraliswine.com/glyphosate isn't bad, it's horrendous, with dashes separating those words. Also, check out any article or interview you can find online about Mimi. She's one of the truly brilliant scientific minds working at the cutting edge of regenerative viticulture and agriculture in general. She thinks deeply about so many of the issues facing the wine industry, agriculture, and society at large, and everything she talks about is full of big, important ideas that could shape the future of our world for the better. This interview is no different. We skip the backstory and dive right into the big ideas that are occupying Mimi's mind these days, involving experimenting with a sulf-sustaining community. We talk about the need for there to be more integration between rural and urban worlds, the ways that she farms and solve problems at Hopewell, the need to integrate and involve vineyard workers in all aspects of winemaking in the wine world, and so much more. As with anyone on the cutting edge, many of Mimi's ideas are controversial and even incendiary. I hope that you are incensed, intrigued, and inspired by this interview with one of the great minds of our time. The sponsor for today's episode is Centralis Wine. That's CENTRALAS Wine. You can learn more about Centralis at centraliswine.com, and full disclosure, Centralis is my winery. I started Centralis because I noticed a disconnect between the values that many wine drinkers have and the kinds of wine they choose to drink. I wanted to give those of you who love wine an option to buy wine that reflects your values. So Centralis is built on two pillars. The first is that Centralis wine will always be made with, at minimum, organically grown grapes. And the second is that we will always tell you every ingredient that was added during winemaking. Our first vintage will be released very soon. In fact, it may be available by the time you hear this, and it's pretty limited, so if you want to get some, please go to our website, centraliswine.com, and sign up for our wine list, or go ahead and buy wine. That's CENTRALAS wine.com. We're also on Instagram at centraliswine, and I can't wait to share our wines with you.
Mimi, thanks so much for doing this. It's really great to talk to you. I mean, I have only known you through seeing videos and hearing podcasts and seeing articles about you and stuff like that, and have admired you from afar greatly. And I just was really relishing a chance to get to talk to you. So thank you so much for doing this.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to meet you virtually and listen to each other's voices.
Great. Yes. And, I know that a lot of, your background has been covered on a lot of other things that you've done out in the world. So, what I tend to like to do anyway is just jump into big ideas and talk about things that fascinate you and you're really geeking out on, and just that, sort of define who you are and your values and things like that, if that's okay with you.
That's my favorite. I'm done talking about myself. Let's talk about big ideas. Yeah.
Oh, awesome. I love it. I love it. All the best people are done talking about themselves, I think.
Well, who cares anyway? God, it's exhausting. Yeah. No, let's talk about cool stuff.
Cool. I'm tempted to just say, since you have had a fair bit of publicity, what do you wish you'd been asked that you haven't been asked yet? Like, what are some of the questions that you'd like to dig into that you haven't gotten an opportunity?
I guess
you can think about that if you want to.
It's a great question. I love it when people sort of turn the question on the person being questioned. And I think for me, what I really want, because people are so fascinated by wine, they really love, to talk about how viticulture and the way that we manage vineyards is relevant to, be it climate change or ecological resilience or any of those things. But I mean, I usually have tried to just use that as a wedge of, opening the door a little bit wider and talking about how we think about landscape level management and what the real problem is in front of us right now, which is it's a
Mm.
landscape level problem. And there's never been a better moment than right now to engage people about not just where their food comes from, but what happens with supply chains that are global, and why resilient ecosystems beget resilient autonomous supply chains. It's not to say that the global economy needs to disappear. We could debate that another time. But for me, if we were to really look at our biggest opportunity right now, it's to change the way we do agriculture and make it regionally appropriate, make it scale appropriate, and at the same time try to use that step change, that kind of step change shift, to also address the systemic problems that we have with racial inequality and social justice and all of the other things that are totally linked to the way that we've viewed our relationship with land in this country and frankly around the world. But it's largely driven by this sort of Western manifest destiny, conquering territory, the way that we've chiseled up the landscape through ownership boundaries. I think that's, for me, that's where the big bucks are right now for,
Mm.
opportunity wise.
It's a huge problem to tackle because it's part of our, I guess, embedded psychology, like our inculcated everything, right? Like it's part of the fabric of just the way that we view the world as Americans or Westerners, I guess. Do you think do you think
Possible.
changing that is possible? I hate to ask.
I
I hate
know.
to ask the
I
hopeless
think
question, but
you must ask because it's the obvious question. And yes, I do believe it's possible. I don't think that these things happen um, abruptly
quickly.
or overnight
Yeah.
unless there's a catastrophe, which I think, all of us who care about these issues really want to avoid catastrophe. And so we have to look at it in something, what would be the step changes that would need to happen to change that mindset. Because I think, you know, if you just look at the sort of psychology of our relationship with land, it's not truly embedded. We're not, like in our history, it is embedded in the last, several hundred or so years, but we're not so far removed from a much more benign way of looking at stewardship and landscape and the sort of health, permanence, and beauty commitment. And so I think that, to your question, the way, if it's possible through example. And so my little um, a thought experiment right now, it's not little at all, but would be to take a region. I'm going deep already, man. So stop me if you want to
Do it.
change directions. But
Not not a okay, but I love it. Go for it.
but
Take a region.
you would take a region that is isolated enough already that let's say the community already has a fairly libertarian spirit. And so the idea of being an autonomous food and fiber shed would not be so offensive to them to be autonomous and regionally stable. And where there are some already embedded regenerative farmers who are working and probably really struggling, if we're all being honest about what it takes to work this way right now, that those people maybe look like the outliers in those communities. But I know of specific examples just here in Oregon where those communities are small enough that there's a lot of trust and everyone knows each other. And what's interesting is in sort of looking at several different places, just because this is how I do thought experiments, I'm like, does this place actually exist? And you look around and you start thinking about how you would do it, because you couldn't do it in the Willamette Valley. You certainly couldn't do it in almost any place in California, because those places are so beholden to the like immediately being able to get what you want from Amazon 2 hours later. But in a place like, just to take an example that I've been fixated on, the sort of Wallowa Basin, and the farmers there are
Did you
all
say Walla? You said
Wallowa.
Walla
So,
Walla?
yeah, no, Wallowa. So the Wallowas are a mountain range here in Oregon, northeastern Oregon. Beautiful. It's like one of my favorite places to backpack. And uh, like the agriculture there is largely, small grains, grass seed, ranching, and the farmers all know each other, even though they're not all practicing the same sort of philosophical type of agriculture. They all know each other, and there's a lot of trust and a lot of communication already. And the community itself is so kind of codependent because they get a lot of snow and they're very far away from a lot of infrastructure, and so the schools are very close. There's a local health clinic that actually has a holistic medicine arm attached to it. So you look at a place like that and you say to yourself, if you could get that community to buy into, let's say, a 70-30 or an 80-20, we're going to produce 70% of the food and fiber in this watershed for this watershed. And in so doing, we're committed to also improving the water holding capacity and the water filtration, because a lot of these communities that I've looked at, just in this thought experiment, the populations have similar health problems. And I think that right now, more than ever, especially during COVID, people are starting to look at the quality of their lives before this happened, and are acknowledging that the way we lived before is not the way we're going to live in the future. And yet we have a tremendous power to affect what that looks like right now, because everybody's at home. Most people aren't doing what they usually do. And so I think there's never been a better time to create a regional model that would actually work and look at the net benefits back to that community and the net benefits back to that ecosystem, and then use that as an example for designing regional systems that actually are autonomous food and fiber sheds. It's not to say you can't be 20 or 30% connected to those things that we absolutely have to live, we need them to survive, but it would largely be more informational and sort of intellectually based trade at that point. But the tactile things that you need, the food, the fiber, the water, all coming from within. And if you think about that from even just a food security, national security, regional security, I think that appeals on many levels. I realize that it also sounds a little bit like communism, but I think that there are ways of talking about this that would appeal even to sort of deep populist and deep libertarian views.
Yeah, and when you mean communism, I think you also are referencing more like the 60s, 70s communism, not necessarily the Russian Soviet Union communism.
Precisely. I mean, more like communal communism, if you will, where,
Right.
there's a buy-in at the community level that we all, the rising tide, and whatever phrase you want to use, but that as a community, we're stronger when we work for our community than when we work for things and people that we don't know or see and don't even know that they exist. We send products, we send agricultural products that take real blood, sweat, and tears all over this globe. And so much of that is wasted. And so much of that creates huge waste from an energy perspective. And especially here, especially now, we know we don't have to do this this way.
Right. I'm from Pennsylvania, a small valley in the south central part of Pennsylvania, and I imagine there are places there. I mean, there are places there that I wish would be open to that, because they're old Mennonite and Amish communities that are very insular, and basically have been self-sustaining for years and years, and then the communities that have sort of grown up, the more modern, quote unquote, mainstream communities that have grown up around in the same area. But there are a lot of little pockets all through Appalachia, for sure, where people are isolated, and I'm fascinated by that as well. That's it. I was just listening to something that Steve Matheson did with the Lodi farmers back in the day, when they were trying to increase their sort of market profile. And he described them as real dyed-in-the-wool overalls wearing farmers who all just decided that sustainability was the way to go. And he sort of helped create a blueprint and sat down with each of them. And of course, everyone had autonomy, but they had that shared goal and shared mission, and so they were able to move the needle in that direction. It was kind of an inspiring thing. It was something that he was hired to do as a consultant. I just happened upon it by listening to a podcast with him. But
was that the beginning of the Lodi rules? Is that where that all kind of started?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Very cool.
Which he
story.
said he used like a Wisconsin potato growers handbook as like a model for what he used, but it hadn't been done with wine before, so it was kind of sort of a inaugural thing. He sort of broke ground on that idea, and then, but yeah, I don't know, maybe it'd be worth looking back into Wisconsin potato growers before that to see what they were up to. There might be some interesting history there. I love the thought experiment. Are you doing anything to see about making it happen? I'm sure you're plenty busy as it is without taking on massive regional projects.
Well, and actually, I totally am. It's what I think, wine and viticulture aside, the most important work that needs to be done right now is cracking these bigger questions and really breaking down the barriers to this way of farming becoming conventional. If we are going to change the way the landscape functions and the way our children and future generations experience this place more positively rather than more negatively, I think that right now that is the most important work that I can do. And so I'm very focused on that. And I don't know if that, designing that model and trying to make it happen is the way that it will, kind of unfold. But I do know that that is what is most important for me to be working on right now. And it comes down to, we haven't even figured out what regenerative really means and needs and looks like in different regions and for different crops, and how integrated does a farm need to be, and how much habitat needs to be rebuilt, so that the amount of land that's actually under, I guess, what you would call intensive production can shrink. Because we know, at least I've learned this in every system that I've been a part of, when you start repairing things at the very earliest trophic level, so from the soil level up, you can do so much more with less footprint. And so you can kind of give back to nature these pieces that we've farmed fence post to fence post just because we think, more acres equal more dollars, and that we've really reached the law of diminishing returns on that. I think we can't squeeze more blood out of a turnip without replenishing the bank that we've exhausted. So, I mean, I don't exactly know how I'm going to move forward, but I'm talking to a lot of farmers in a lot of different regions, trying to get a sense of where are the critical masses of people who are working regeneratively and really trying to figure that out in their systems, and how connected are they to the other people in their community, and how does this become a vector for, rapid change, where the incentives that currently are keeping us in a conventional farming model and keeping regenerative people. I mean, this is something that I think you probably think about a lot too. But if you farm regeneratively and you have an integrated farm with multiple systems and animals involved and everything, I mean, that is a massive commitment that you make, both financially, emotionally, and physically. And then say you make wine on top of that, and you need to brand that wine accordingly so that you can, this is how I look at it, so that wine, hopefully being an extraordinary example, can start a conversation that you want to have with people about where their food comes from. But in the meantime, there's that sort of 80% of your creative mental energy that needs to be spent on branding, which is supposed to attract the attention of maybe, 2%, if I'm being generous, of the population that is actually spending money that way. But the people we need to communicate with are the 98%. And so right now, all of our mental energy and focus is trying to get the dollars of those people who are wealthy enough to pay for food and wine that's grown regeneratively. Whereas if this is ever going to be for the people, by the people, it needs to be accessible to them. And so it has to be the conventional model. It should not be the luxury model, because if only the super wealthy can afford to farm regeneratively, this never goes anywhere. And that's why, I mean, I think those small, like those of us who are really struggling to make it, who, kind of look at our budgets, especially in a year like this, and say, I don't know how we're gonna do this for one more year, much less how I'm gonna devote, another 60% of my time to developing a regional model for change. But this is what we could do right now. I mean, I really do. I'm more hopeful than I'm cynical, because I think just from every perspective, we're starting to see the systemic sort of fallout of the way we use land.
Yeah. Do you think that at some, on a practical level, or maybe like I don't know how to put this. It's not a practical thing necessarily, because there's logistical hurdles involved, but getting some of the brain power and youth out of the urban centers and into the countryside is something that has to happen to make this happen.
Absolutely.
Or do you think?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
Go ahead, please.
No, I want you to finish your thought, because it sounded like it was going in a really good direction.
No, it's one of those things where you start, I guess, when I hear criticisms of the unsustainability of, of a regenerative farming practice, it's usually because the person is thinking about applying it to conventional monoculture, which is impossible. Of course, it's going to fail,
Mm-hmm.
and, it's designed for one person in a tractor to do 100 acres, and that's not the kind of agriculture that we're talking about. We're talking about many hands sharing the labor, as well as sharing the economic benefits, the health benefits, everything that spills out of that. And it's a whole different way of looking at agriculture. And so, yeah, go on. That's where I was going.
Well, I really think there's a beautiful, I mean, so the WPA, post World War II, the sort of rebuilding of the infrastructure, or the building of the infrastructure of America. I mean, there was definitely um, a lot of good was done with that, but also a lot of harm. I mean, if you think about the damming of the rivers, et cetera, et cetera. But
Mm,
where we could do that, but to a different end now, I mean, the reinvestment, the sort of post apocalypse reinvestment of in American ingenuity in redesigning landscapes that are both functional and beautiful and healthy, and then taking, where we need to have urban density. I certainly believe that that's true. I mean, I don't want to just like send everybody out onto the countryside and have a house every 5 feet. I think urban density is critical, and designing beautiful urban centers as well, and centers for urban agriculture could be part of this. But getting people from very, I guess, what I would say, bleak urban centers out into not just farmland, but into nature, and really educating the generation right now that is getting lost in this really strange moment that we're having, that there would be
mm,
no better education right now than to put those people outside and say, this is what a healthy life looks like, where you are surrounded by nature and you do your work so that you can feed yourself and feed your community and rebuild the sort of wild nature that has been lost because of agriculture at the same time, and see how those systems, the working lands and the natural systems, can knit themselves together so that real ecological resilience can be achieved, where you reconnect broken networks of communication and gas exchange and all of the things that we've interrupted so perfectly. um, and do that as a learning process, because we don't learn that, we're not teaching that. And we teach that farms are farms and forests are forests, and we need to start re-educating ourselves about function and why things that are functioning actually help us function better. That the deterioration of our landscape is, you know stepwise the same as the deterioration in our mental and physical health and our national security and all of the things that are going wrong right now.
and potentially, again, going back to that, bringing people into new environments, I think would help heal some of the political divide that we have in this country as well. I mean, every time I leave LA, I come back and say, people need to get out of LA. Like you need to go see the rest of the country, because it ain't like this, it
Yeah,
is very much different from what we're used to in Los Angeles, and not in a bad way. It's different, and that's it. It's got its own honor, it's got its own, it's just as viable, just as virtuous. It's just different, and I think the more people are exposed to that, like the more humanizing the more humanizing of an effect it has. um, and I think it's really important at this point as well, to get some of these things done, to have those
I
bridges
think,
built, basically.
yeah, I think that's such an important point that you make, because the code of, I guess, it's not just etiquette, it's like basic humanity. It shouldn't be regional. It shouldn't be
Right.
regionally specific. Like, we shouldn't have LA manners and New York manners and country manners. I think the sort of the way that we silo ourselves to whatever we're used to is at, it's rooted in fear, and it's rooted in, how we just want to be comfortable all the time. And all of these problems that we face right now are going to require us to be uncomfortable. And we need to just get really good. I mean, we need to practice that, I think, practice being uncomfortable, practice being embarrassed and humble and beginner.
Yeah.
That's the mentality I think that we need to lead with. Not this like, I have all the answers and I know the destination and I will lead us forth into victory. But we're beginning, and we will always be beginning, and we will never have the answers, but we can adhere to a common code of decency and humanity that isn't just for people, it's for the land as well. And I think you're absolutely spot on to make that point. I mean, we do really silo ourselves.
And you're saying it's okay to live an uncurated real life.
Yeah, I mean, it's the one I want to. I just, I
Right.
don't care. I don't care what it looks like on Instagram because it's not. It's not pretty. But it's real, and it's honest, and it cares about, trying to be humble, and really trying to find solutions for everyone, not just for the people who can afford it.
Yeah. So that's some macro stuff for sure. um, I let me just ask a different question for you. When you Let's just go real specific.
Mm.
How do you solve problems on the farm at Hopewell? Like
Mm.
when you encounter something in the vines or just in general, but vines would be great. Keep it, wine oriented. How do you respond?
Great question. Kind of depends on what it is, but I think, to I I think I understand what you're getting at here. When when you go from, because the way that we did this was, we took something that was a Christmas tree farm and had no organic matter, and then we decided to just, go kind of whole hog into regenerative practices, whatever that meant. And so it has been a very iterative process, and there have been really scary moments along the way. And just for example, I mean, if you don't have irrigation, which we do not, we've had a lot of drought years. I mean, a lot of like really hot, some of our hottest, driest years during this period. And there have been real, where, say, I watched our pruning weights go down for 3 years in a row. Um, and that was even with sort of really managing the crop so that it wasn't taking too much out of the vines, and trying to, compost well and all that kind of thing. But when you aren't using foliar nutrients and things like that, you're sort of limited in what you can do. And so my approach has always been to try to, there's always a moment of like, holy shit, what have I done? And, the fear that comes with that. But, when you get trapped in that emotion, you're just going to, whatever action you take is going to be just a reflection of that emotion, and not a real solution, I guess. And I always try to remember that Hopewell, the vineyard, the site, the project, the wines, etc. It's all about a mission, which is to try to learn so that others can have the courage to learn. And so staying committed to certain practices and seeing them through, even when it seems very scary. So just for example, in that case of the pruning weights going down and down, I went and started, digging holes and measuring the organic matter, and the sort of coming down, the decline in our pruning weights was very much in line, sort of at opposite curves with the increase in our organic matter. And so we were building organic matter while losing pruning weights. And that seemed like a bit of a conundrum. But once I started really thinking about it, you can build organic matter by, stopping tillage, by adding compost, by composting in place and having diverse cover crops and all of those things. But those new exchange sites that are created in that organic matter and the nutrients that are bound to those exchange sites can't be released until your microbiology catches up, right? So you have to overcome certain thresholds when you're transitioning a system or when you're trying to rebuild back to a baseline level. And just by taking a breath and saying, look, our microbiology is in a good trend, and our organic matter is certainly on a good trend. I trust that these vines aren't gonna crack. I mean, it's not like they were dying in place. They were certainly getting a little bit weaker and weaker and weaker. And so I just decided to take a break and pause and give it one more year and see how we did the following year. And sure enough, the following year, we had not just a return of vigor, but a return of, a higher pruning weight. And that trend consistently increased over the next several years. And so I think remembering that this is not a human timescale that we're dealing with. And so the changes that we want to see are attached to our human concept of time and our agricultural concept of time, and churning out, in real time what's probably inappropriate for certain states of a system. So just reminding myself of the mission and of the time, and trusting that these repair mechanisms that are built into just what drives life itself, they don't care what we're doing. They're going to keep trying to repair a system even when we're doing really bad things. And when we're trying to do less bad things, or when we stop doing bad things, those things are ongoing. You can't always see them, and you don't always know how quickly they're working. But so it takes a certain level of faith and a certain level of trust. But then if you have the patience, the reward is almost always right around the bend. And I have other examples of that, but I think that's probably the best one, because I hear all the time from people, we tried to go no-till, but in year 3, the vineyard was just crashing. Or you could just tell that the vines were getting weaker and weaker and weaker. And there's an assumption that that's a trend that's never going to stop. And those are the places where we try to push the hardest, where you just, like, if we can't learn this way, if we won't experiment in this way, then nobody will.
And knowing what I've heard you say in terms of your ideas and the ideas that you're pushing for, I always have this sense of you as having a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde conundrum in just on the farm there, because I feel like the one side of you would rather that it was just a wild landscape, and that these vines were just sort of, trellised over pine trees, and just a forest that you went out and gathered, just wild grapes, and that was how you made your wine, if you were going to make wine at all from it, versus the other side, which is you have a commercial vineyard. There are demands for that. There's a need to show that it's possible to do that, I think, is part of what you're trying to do. And yet that takes you in this other direction that is less, that is tied to conventional viticulture, agriculture in many ways. Do you find that push and pull? Am I making that up, or is that something that you wrestle with?
No, you've totally nailed me. It is a constant battle. And I think that one of the struggles that I have is just I just know that viticulture, especially with Vitis vinifera, this European cultivar that we've kept, it's been clonally reproduced for so many hundreds of years. And we are so attached to it, and I mean, me included, that there was a it was almost like if your goal is to make change, then you have to work within the systems that need to be changed. And or at least that's how I've looked at it heretofore. Because I think that to just put vines in a forest, it will get people's attention, but getting people to move needs to seem relevant to them. It needs to seem like
Hmm.
something other than just a farce, I guess. And while I do think that, sort of um, agroforestry with viticulture is certainly possible. And not just possible, it may well be the future, especially if we want to get serious about disease control and breaking up monocultures. Um, but design and function are also both really important to me. And I think that just being random is, um, I mean, it's interesting. It is really interesting, and I think it's fun and captivating, and can certainly capture people's imaginations. But if you want to set things up in a way where you can prove that something works, then I think you have to look at the model that people are currently working in and then flip it over and say, yes, we can grow Vitis vinifera in this system without irrigation, without cultivation, and make extraordinary wines without sacrificing the integrity of this landscape. Um, and I don't think it can be done everywhere in the world. I mean, I do think that there are limits. There are
Right.
empirical limits in some systems that just have not been acknowledged, I guess. But if we're talking about, the sort of temperate regions where wine is largely grown, most of those systems should be able to do it without, without these massive disturbance patterns that we're so tied to. It can't be done overnight, and I think it's probably best not done cold turkey. But there are ways to transition, and that's the hand holding that needs to happen if we are going to convert the the masses to better practices, then we have to meet them where they are.
Well, and what I hear you saying when you say the masses is I think a bit of another split that you have, which is I think a big part of your mission is to talk to farmers and set an example for farmers as much as consumers, if not more than consumers. Is that fair to say?
That is fair. I mean, I think the education has to happen on both sides, and consumers will definitely help drive the change. But with
Right.
farmers, I mean, the real problem is that farmers have not had the support of their communities for more than 100 years. I mean, it's
Right.
really it's easy to divide things up politically and sort of blame the world's ills on farmers who drive one tractor over thousands and thousands of miles, but they didn't get there because they thought it was a good idea. I mean, this was
Right.
driven by a totally almost random industry that came out of a war model, basically a moment in history that changed everything, but especially the way that we work the land. And farmers will always, I think, rise to the occasion when they're supported by their communities. Because if you think about what it means to be a farmer these days, you have one shot a year to pay the bank, and
Yeah.
you're either going to make it or you're not going to. And most people don't have a lot of tolerance for risk, and they're certainly not being, like their neighbor down the road who's a doctor or a lawyer or a teacher isn't stopping by and saying, hey, can I grab 16 bales from you this week because, I've got a couple of cows that, we feed and slaughter every year. That's all a thing of the past. The only people who have visited farmers in the last 100 years are the chemical sales reps and the extension agents, and that model again is industrially supported and hasn't shifted very quickly to look at alternative ways of farming. I mean, farms have just gotten bigger and bigger and farther apart and owned by fewer and fewer people. So, I mean, I think there's no part of me that would meet a farmer, no matter what the sort of political side of the spectrum that they come from. I have never met one who sits down every night at the table and says, I just want to do something bad to the land tomorrow. I mean, they all care about what, they're there. Like, you don't do this because it's making you a lot of money or a really easy life for you. You do it because, usually the land means something to you, the place means something to you, the crop means something to you, what it means to your family, all of those things. And so I think that there's those farmers are the solution, and they just need to be spoken to like the pillars of the community that they really are. So yeah, I mean, I do sort of go back and forth with my thinking about how are we going to, it's a chicken and an egg thing. We need people on the consumer end too, educating them about, why it really does matter to not just look at the label and say, oh, it says grass fed. Like, figure out what that means on that label. Find out where that cooperative really buys from. Find out, if it's organically grown, how it's organically grown. And really, if you can find a way to know, and this is much easier obviously in California than it is in most places in the world, but
Yeah.
locating and thanking, even if you can't buy their stuff, but thanking the farmers that work around you for, the things that they do that positively and even frankly negative, but just acknowledging that they're there. I mean, I think
Yeah.
it's a population that feels invisible, and if not
Mm.
invisible, then just straight up maligned.
Right. I, I I had a question here asking you about how you engage with farmers and especially vineyard managers, those kind of farmers, when there's disagreement, when they don't see organic as a viable solution, or better than organic as a viable solution. But I imagine it's a little easier for you than it is for some people, because you're coming from such an empathic place, really, and even more than empathic, really, a place of admiration.
Totally. I mean, I really do. My guts have been spilled all over the ground in the sort of heartache and struggle that everybody goes through as a farmer. The times that things really go south and there's nowhere. I mean, there's nowhere to turn. I mean, when nature does her take, there's there's nobody there's really nobody to turn to except for each other. And I think that building community, I mean, even when there's disagreement, because I think it is a really worthwhile thing to actually get into a conversation with somebody who really disagrees with you but is willing to have a conversation about it, because you can talk, I mean, you can bring things up with one another that are relevant and thought provoking, and maybe plant seeds or just create trust. Just building trust, I think, is such a huge part of changing hearts that people often overlook. Because I mean, look, you can hand somebody a spray program and say, do this if you want to be organic. It's not the same as saying, look, hey, this isn't going to be easy. I'm not going to promise you overnight success. I would never say that to another farmer, especially. But
Right.
I'm your I'm your I'm your 3 a.m. phone call. I mean, I will pick up the phone and I will come and look at your farm with you in that moment, and I will try to troubleshoot this with you, even if you're not organic. Like, we all, the land. I mean, I have really, you've probably heard me say this because I say it all the time, but the concept of ownership, I think, it's problematic when it comes to the land. Like, my neighbor's land almost means more to me than my land because of the way it's being farmed right now. It's so hard. And so, like, the investment that I feel in the lands under other
Yeah.
people's care is every bit as much as I feel in my own. And I think that that's really meaningful to people when you can stand with them in their place and say, oh boy, I wasn't even thinking about this challenge that you're facing. Let me chew on that for a minute. Let me think about this from, just a different perspective. I mean, if I can come up with any idea, then I'll send you 500 thoughts, and we'll see if any of them stick. But that building of trust between the camps, if you will, or just between individual farmers, it's like, I'm not here to judge you. You know, there's no part of me that feels any judgment of anybody who's brave enough to farm. But I definitely feel like I want to help. I want to see
Mhm.
people be healthy. I want to see people work less and feel better about the lives they're leading. And we've come a long ways away from that, I think.
Yeah, I feel that same thing. I mean, I don't even have farms within a stone's throw of me. But when I visit vineyards, I was just up in the high desert at a vineyard 2 days ago, and I was just like everything I could do because they're farming conventionally, and I was just like, if I mean, I just was like, we buy grapes commercially, and if you farmed organically, we would buy from you. Like, I was doing everything I could to just like to up to the point of being like, I will come and do the viticulture myself for you for free, like just to see
Mm-hmm.
that vineyard, which is a lovely vineyard, maybe in a crazy place, but it's anytime I see something like that, it's just I want it to be a healthier place. I want to help make it more, make it a great place. I feel like with your ownership thing, maybe you were just born in the wrong, era, a few years too late.
Totally.
I feel that too. Um, so you brought up, you touched on the idea of vinifera and I mean, if you had your choice, would you be growing something else? Would you be finding native wild grapes and trying to, you know, hybridize or like breed those into something that would taste good when you made it into wine? What would you be doing if you weren't trying to show that you could do what you're doing the way you're doing it, and you just had a blank slate and could do whatever you want?
Well, I mean,
Does that make sense?
so we have, yeah, totally. We have, um, you know, we have seedlings every year that I sort of dig up and then put in the forest, and just like you said, let them grow up trees.
I knew
Um,
it. I knew
just yeah,
it.
just because the curious part of me. I mean,
Yeah.
are our tastes are what they are, and I would be the last one to say that I have found the hybrid version that I feel confident would, kind of outseat, I guess, or at least give some breathing room to Vitis vinifera. Because, I mean, I
Right.
think that a lot of the problems that we have are due to monoculture. It's not because Vitis vinifera is so bad, but, we've been clonally selecting and clonally breeding based on certain traits that don't necessarily have a lot to do with fitness.
Right.
And, the ones that do have a lot to do with fitness tend to be the ones that aren't selected for flavor. And so I'm dubious. I am pretty dubious about getting really ambitious about making hybrid wines, because there's a part of me, I mean, you probably say this even better than I can about me and where I could go, but there is a part of me that thinks, you know, eventually I want my farm to be, 5 acres of Vitis vinifera, and the rest of it should be either diversified farm or wild. Like, we should rewild it, and I should get out of the commercial, like selling of grapes to other winemakers, and really sort of redesign the farm so that it functions more the way that I want it to. Um, but having said that, I think there is something about that European wine grape, that it's so culturally rich and it's so entrenched in our imagination and in our, the books and the poetry and all of the things that have kind of followed our cultures over the years, and it's cross cultural, and it is so captivating. But I think for me, it would probably, like, if I stopped doing Vitis vinifera, I probably stopped doing wine. And
Mm.
I'll be the first person to say I'm open to whatever future, happens for me. But for now, at least, I haven't found, like, the grapes that we grow in the forested areas. They're fascinating to me because they almost always look and taste like Riesling, and B, they never have powdery mildew. The red ones are always a little bit, they're always a little foxy, and
Mm.
none of them ferment. None of them are fermented in a way that I felt like I wanted to get out and, start talking about in a really aggressive way. But
Mm.
it is interesting to look at them just in terms of, like, how many thousands of years would it take to, or hundreds, to find the one that is fit and delicious and ferments beautifully. And do
And
we, is that worth chasing? I don't know. I don't
mm,
know.
I guess for me, it's maybe I'm blaming the wrong thing, but I guess it just seems strange that that for time immemorial has sort of been the process where you know you you look within the natural landscape and you find whatever's growing there, and then you sort of breed it in the best way that you can, just do your own sort of human version of natural selection over decades, hundreds of years, maybe millennia, until you find,
Hmm.
until something has established as the favorite for whatever reason, for multiple reasons, usually for that, and it's very tied to that area. And then we've decided, oh, that's it. That's the pinnacle for the whole world. Like, we're just going to take it from Burgundy and transplant it around the world and say, we're never going to cultivate anything ever again. The whole process stops now for the rest of the world, kind of thing. I guess that's the weird thing to me. It seems like there must be more potential for other areas. Maybe it won't be Pinot Noir. Maybe it won't achieve what Pinot Noir does in Burgundy, or anything that you could make that same analogy with. But maybe it will achieve something uniquely just as good or close to as good for that area where it came from. Where it developed. I don't know. These are just my sort of big idea thoughts about it. But you're right. I
No, and
guess
it's
your final
keep
question
going,
is
keep going.
really the damning one, which is like, is it worth? Is that even worth the effort? Because at the end of the day, we have great wine that we like, and hey, like, why recreate the wheel? Maybe that is,
Well,
maybe that's what it's akin to.
well, I said that I asked that, I posed that question in a provocative way, because I think that you know, I think where you and I both sort of agree is that, not even sort of agree, wholeheartedly agree, is that the alcohol is an acquired taste, right? We're not born to like it. And our bodies really struggle to, make it anything less than a toxin. And so I think that the fact that I mean, it is a perfect example of something that, coffee would be similar, where we have cultivated our tastes over these, hundreds, if not thousands of years, because not so much because of anything that was innate in Vitis vinifera, but because of the way that we've spoken about it, the way that it's become part of our stories and our folklore and our poetry and our songs and our culture at the table, our way of sharing ideas and all of those things. It is so tied with that there's something really beautiful and art and really part of an artistic effort to me that exists now in a almost purely cultural space. And so, like, almost as a
Hmm.
library item, it is interesting and worth preserving. But to your point, I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but this is where I would draw your point. The fact that we've cultivated our appreciation for this thing, it's and all of its iterations and all of the places. The fact that, Bordeaux is Bordeaux and Burgundy is Burgundy and Chianti and all of the things that we have made ourselves believe, not and believe, so like it becomes part of your fabric to appreciate, but as an acquired appreciation. And so I think that can't be an end point. It's not to say that couldn't be the, some other thing that we now start to cultivate an appreciation for. But the barriers to that right now, I probably don't need to point out to you, because as anybody who's a reasonably young winemaker can say, being a new brand out there, I mean, it's really, really difficult to set yourself apart in a way that actually captivates the attention and turns the eye away from the norm, I guess, as
Right.
anything other than an outlier. Like as a one-time buy for sure, with a consistent following, maybe for a while, but as a generational business, that's going to take a coordinated effort, I think. I mean, a real like desire to say, as part of an American wine tradition, if we really wanted to make it an American wine tradition, would it not be wise to think about that being an American grape? And I think that's I mean,
Right.
there's a very noble cause there. I just don't know
Yeah.
I don't know who's gonna lead it. I mean,
Somebody very
there are
rich.
definitely people doing really cool work, but yes,
Yeah.
exactly. That's the thing. I
Yeah.
mean, that's where this whole thing falls apart again, because it's not by the people for the people, if only people who can afford to lose incredible amounts of money changing the hearts and minds of the world
Yeah.
can do it.
Now, having said that, the East Coast may be,
Yeah.
the East Coast is unique that way. So I interviewed Carl Humpsch, who's the owner of Loving Cup Vineyards. It's the only certified organic winery in Virginia, and I think one of like three on the entire East Coast. So kind of,
Oh, that's so ballsy.
I
Being
know.
organic over there. I mean,
Oh yeah, and
it's
he says that. I mean, he's like, look, it's hubris to think you can do what other people can't, and he's like, the reality is I may fail, but he's been at it for like 12 years, and he is merciless. He has basically trialed over 50 varietals varieties in his vineyard, and when they don't work, he rips them out and plants new ones and keeps going. And he is not
wow.
rich. Like they had a frost. They had a freeze like 6 hours below, like I think 24 degrees on Mother's Day this year.
Whew.
So they lost everything.
Oh, oh,
He's like, we're not even. He's like, I think 80% is gone. And 2 years ago, they had over 100 inches of rain during the growing season, and so they basically
what?
didn't. They lost something as well. This is
Oh,
Virginia
18.
weather.
I was just, yeah, no, I was just
Yeah,
talking
18,
to,
yeah. There
yeah,
were
a
like two
Maryland farmer
hurricanes.
who,
Yeah,
yeah. Oh,
yeah.
God.
And
Yeah.
so the way that he has survived is 19 was perfect. And they like had a
Hmm.
huge crop. They made like twice as much wine as they ever make. And they're like gonna be able to sell that this year. And hopefully next year there won't be another catastrophe, you know? Although it does seem like more and more the catastrophes are bunching up closer and closer. With climate change and the
Hmm.
weather weirding that's happening. But yeah, I mean, it was in talking to him that I just saw this potential. Like on the East Coast, the consumer is a lot more interested in or open to be just by virtue of exposure weird things that they've never heard of before. Because there's a new
Yeah.
hybrid every location you go to. That's something else is growing, whether it's Pennsylvania or Virginia or New York or Vermont. There's something new that's somebody's trying out, and it's all different styles, sweet and dry and off dry, and I don't know, I look to them almost more, even though like we're the West Coast is the wine producing capital of America. I think the East Coast might be where the future is in terms of that American grape, like the one that becomes the Pinot Noir for Burgundy for America kind of thing.
Well,
Just
and
throwing that.
I mean, it's by necessity, right? I mean,
Right, right.
I think, obviously there's a real creative spirit, especially in the gentleman that you referenced, who I'm going to send a card to immediately. But
Yeah,
I mean, so like when you are in those extreme places, I mean, if you want to grow something you can ferment, you need to work with something that's not going to die every single year, certainly. And just looking at the disease pressure that Vitis vinifera would have in that kind of humidity, and the just the growing season that they experience there.
yeah,
I think necessity can often drive ingenuity and then change taste, just because if the local population does support it and it takes hold, it's you know that's how things change. And
yeah,
it also could be a huge part of changing the conversation about, ecological infrastructure to protect against some of those big events, because I think that's, at once we need to have crops and cultivars that have a capacity to adapt to the way the climate is going to change going forward. But we also don't have to accept that the amount of land conversion that has gotten us to where our climate is in such a bad way that we couldn't reconvert. In other words, we couldn't turn this ship around and start rebuilding the networks of plant communities and ecological communities that are the first line of defense against those massive events that happen. And they drain things faster, they interrupt massive winds and all of those things. But that's part of that sort of land plant communication strategy that needs to be part of landscape level change. But I think it's an interesting entryway into that conversation again, and wine is a good and powerful vector for that.
yeah. Um, you, I'm guessing, have to use sulfur or stylet oil or something. What do you use on your vines to prevent
For
mildew
the
and
yeah
detritus?
yeah So, for us, it's really powdery mildew. Botrytis is less of a problem. I mean, it's just been, pretty much drier in recent years. Botrytis is, like I say, like a 5-year problem for us. So yeah, sulfur historically has been the backbone of organic spray programs. I don't
Mhm.
use oils. I haven't ever really liked the result of using oils. I do think that they're pretty effective, especially early season, at prevention, but I don't like what they do to the arthropod
Got it.
communities. I
Yeah.
mean, it's just really tough on beneficials, and so we don't use any oils, and we try to use as little sulfur as possible. I have to say that spray technology has not come as far as I wish that it had, because we just this year rebuilt a we rebuilt one of the first electrostatic sprayers on the West Coast. It's like from 1998, and it's electrostatic technology. It's used in a lot of orchards and stuff, but for a hot second, it was maybe going to stick in vineyards. But I think because a lot of the first models were tested in California, where it was really windy and really hot and really dry, the grounding effect was less. And then also the wind, because you're not spraying as much material, the wind made it hard for, the real results to be seen. But that technology has really changed the game for me in terms of not having to use as much sulfur. So this year, which has been one of the higher pressure years we've had in a long time, last year was another really high pressure year where organic growers would easily, sail right past 50 pounds per acre of total sulfur use and spray sulfur well past bloom just to have adequate control. And, some number of like 16, 17 sprays in the growing season, which is just
Wow.
unacceptable,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's such a, the hugest elephant you could possibly put in a room. So we've gotten to where, with this rebuilt, super janky, has to be basically put back together after every spray. But the technology has allowed us to spray, somewhere between 15 and 20 gallons per acre of total material. So that's water use, and that minimizes the amount of chemical because the adhesion is so great.
Oh,
So
great.
this year, we're going to spray, like, I think last time I checked, we were almost at 15 pounds per acre of sulfur for the year. And we will use, there's a new product out that is a sweet lupin oil derivative that I trialed this year, and I really, really liked it. It's ridiculously expensive, but I also have found that, like, the horn silica spray, from biodynamics, because I sort of dip my toe occasionally in the preps. And I did a bunch of biodynamic trials where we did everything exactly by the book. And it's not that I didn't, the philosophy doesn't, I take no issue with it. But in terms of, like, some of the other things that we've done experimentally, like with the tea preparations that we do, have just been much more interesting to me in terms of the result in the vineyard and in the wines. So, but what I will say is that the horn silica and the equisetum, I find to be, if you time them well, can really extend your fungicide intervals if you're organic. But
Oh, nice.
you really have to track it and pay attention, because you will only learn what works when something doesn't work. So it
Yes.
takes it takes being pretty meticulous about keeping records and knowing what the weather was like during that time, and knowing how close you were to bloom and how close you were to bunch closure. But it's, over the last 12 or so years, we've really kind of dialed in where the true pressure points are. Like, when an epidemic is going to become something really difficult to control, where did you lose control? Because it's almost always farther back than you think it was, and you, like, missed a critical spray because you were like, oh, I'm so clean, I'm just gonna stretch this window a little bit farther. And it's the early season stuff that really matters. So we've
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I used to think that organic viticulture meant you didn't have to do anything. And then I had to rip out
Yeah,
my
try that.
vineyard and replant.
Yeah.
Um,
It is not it's not a cultivar that does well under benign neglect.
um, here's a big question for you that I just wanted to get your thoughts about. What do you think needs to change about the way the wine world has defined great wine to make it a better definition?
Boy, that's a great question. I guess I would have to kind of turn it back around a little bit and say, how do you think it's defined now?
I guess it's obviously kind of a leading question, but I think it's defined in a way that is limited to sensory perception, to how it tastes in the glass. So we can blind taste it and score it on a 100-point score and say, 100 points, it's great. This is a wine for the ages. And I know that simply by sticking my nose in it and swirling it in my mouth and swallowing it. And I feel like there's no context to that. And so here you go. I'm giving you my opinion. I asked for yours. So, but anyway, I'll shut up. But that's how I think it is currently defined.
Okay. So that's fair. I just wanted to make sure that we were sort of coming at it from the same direction.
I think it is. I mean, do you disagree? Do you think
Yeah.
Do you think there's a broader discussion being had about? I guess it's maybe we're talking about there is more diversification in wine press and wine culture now. I guess it up until recently, I'd say in the last decade, though, that was sort of the monoculture of wine, was that approach to it. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I think that the sort of the hedonism driven, the sweetness, the alcohol, the mega purple, and all the the reverse
right.
engineering of 96 points, that that really followed the trend of the American palate, really, which
Yeah.
was for it can't possibly be sweet enough. There can't possibly be enough alcohol in it. And the more there is, the more I like it. But I want to talk about it like it's dry, and and I want to talk about it like it's sustainable. Um, and so for sure, I think that when when we talk about greatness of any endeavor, the process has to be taken into account. It has to be spoken about like this is the real hollowed ground is in the process. It's not in um, the one experience that you maybe have that's informed by how you feel that day and how many cups of coffee you had or whatever. But that I think to what you just said, context means a lot. And that whole, I mean, the wine scoring thing to me is, I mean, I don't have problems with like criticism for, be it literary or artistic or, wine criticism or whatever. I mean, I think it's interesting. I think it creates a platform for people to launch from when they want to talk about how they feel about a particular wine or want to buy something and they've never tried it before. And I do think, you're right. It has gotten much more diverse in terms of the media that people can consume now. It's not just one particular set of tastes that's being represented. But I also think that there's a really critical moment right now for talking about what what is appropriate. what is what is appropriate when it comes to using the land to produce something that maybe shouldn't be mass marketed, right? I mean, I this is controversial. I know I'm going to get into really like uncomfortable territory, but when something gets written about in a critical way, generally speaking, it is a luxury good. It's a piece of art. It's a luxury car. It's a blah blah blah. I don't whatever it is. Um, and that I think then necessarily needs to take into account design, intent, artistry, and then also the process, and which with an agricultural beverage, that heart of that thing is where it came from. And so I think that at the end of the day, in reality, I don't think that it means very much to farm beautifully and then make something that unequivocally tastes bad. And I mean, I think that there's probably not very many options of that. I mean, I haven't really thought
Right.
about it because my gut tells me that if it is tended beautifully, unless a terrible mistake was made, um, it should at least be good, right? But that there
Right.
should be an appreciation built into our criticism for the process involved, and not just the cherry and tobacco and the
Right.
spice notes and the way that we just recycle words to talk about wines. It's really there need
Yeah.
I'm gonna just go ahead and say it. I don't think we need as much wine in the world as there currently is, and a lot of it could go away and nobody would notice. And so if we really wanted to use the opportunity of writing about wine, of talking about wine, to focus on the great work that's being done, a lot of things would change just as a result of that different way of talking about it. I mean, even like
Yeah.
to get back to our previous conversation about what variety it comes from, and what part of the world it comes from. So yeah, I think it's a really good question, and it's a
Well,
loaded one.
it's I'll help you dig your hole even deeper. As as someone who's like myself, and I'm sure you are on a mission to promote these values. I feel like, given the economic realities, that it's kind of like I should be trying to make a delicious table wine that the average person can afford and to buy regularly, that was also made with these values. But do you think that we can and even should make like a $10 wine that is a delicious example of regenerative viticulture, or should I just switch to something besides wine to promote those values?
No, I mean, okay, great question. And I'm a good person, and my wines are not inexpensive. And I have lots of, like, gut problems because of that. And this is where, when we were just talking about how the whole system needs to change in order for you to really, to really be able to produce a a beautiful table wine from regeneratively farmed, because it's got to really be regeneratively farmed, right? And we were
Right.
just talking about what it takes to farm regeneratively, and how if you aren't a vested wealth, like if you don't own your land, if you're in a partnership with the bank, or I don't know where your money comes from, but the burden of, on top of that, farming experimentally in a region where the farming that goes on around you makes it harder to farm benignly, so like you're up against a greater set of hurdles, just based on being either in a monoculture or surrounded by conventional farming that's constantly like dusting you with whatever's coming across the fence line.
Right.
And that really makes it a classist beverage, a classist system, that if unless we can make it so that the average grower who wants to farm benignly is supported to the level that it is the least expensive way to farm. Your inputs actually do go down. Your, the tractor passes go down. All of those things need to be in line in order to really produce a truly, $10. And then I think we also need to talk about, like, at that point we should be putting it in kegs. We should not be putting it in glass bottles, and we should not be shipping it across the
Right.
world. We should be serving it to our local communities, and they should be able to enjoy vast quantities of it. It should be the only thing that they drink. One of the things I've always loved about California is how loyal California, I mean, at least in Southern California, this is not true in the Bay, but Southern California buys California wine. When I go down there
Yeah.
and it's like pushing a boulder up a hill to sell Oregon wine, it makes me happy for you guys, because it's really, you guys could be putting a lot of stuff in kegs and growlers and whatever, but
Yeah.
again, the culture that we expect around wine and the preciousness that we attach to it, that part would have to kind of fade away, or at least would have to be in a very specific category in order for, I think, a truly regeneratively farmed wine to be able to be that
Mm.
inexpensive.
Are you telling me you guys make wine in Oregon?
Isn't Oregon just in Northern California?
um, well, this leads, what you said with that really leads into what I'll just make my final question, so I don't keep you forever, if that's okay. Do you have time for another question?
You betcha.
And I feel like it's important. I feel like you have some thoughts about this that are important to get out there. And that's that I see a class structure within the wine industry where, specifically about vineyard workers, and vineyard workers basically being serfs, or anonymous at best, where winemakers become celebrities, and there's this big divide between, if you're in the cellar versus the vineyard, that it's worse almost racism, but at least classist. And I would venture to bet that the percentage of vineyard workers who have never tasted the wine made from the vineyards that they care for is huge. And I feel like there are so many beneficial things that would come from bridging that chasm, one of which might be better agricultural practices, because if you have to actually work in those fields versus send somebody who you think of as a lesser than to go work in those fields, you might think twice about what you're spraying in them. But again, I just feel like the ways that, I guess the question that I would like to get at would be, what ways can we, and in what ways can the humans who we rely on to care for our vineyards be better integrated, recognized, and honored in the wine world?
Such an important question. I mean, honestly, we need to put them out there. I mean, I think it's critical. I mean, they need to make wine. They need to be part of the conversation. They need to be telling the stories of the vineyards that they care for. They need to be in tastings. They need to be at the table. It is so offensive that that's not, I mean, I don't, because I'm not saying this to you, but it is so offensive that that's not super obvious. Because I think they are invisible.
No, I hear, yeah, no.
Because we make them invisible. We, and we also allow ourselves to think that they want to be invisible. I think sometimes that there's enough of a cultural barrier most of the time, either because, if you're not around those people all the time, then there's always this sort of like shyness about, putting yourself out there and maybe inviting the people who work in the field to either come and have lunch in the winery, or, I mean, it's just, I don't think it's all, I certainly don't think it's overtly intentional most of the time, but when we have these black tie dinners and there's only white people in the room and nobody's talking about anything except how cool is that winemaker, or how amazing is this wine that person made, that's just perpetuating this, like, this really sort of feudalist way that we use land and use people on land, and never really connect with anything. We don't deeply connect with anything or anybody. And the people that work in my vineyard, I've worked with them when I was, waist high on them. They're the same crew that I worked with on my family's farm. And just, it felt like, so it would be like ignoring the fact that my mom raised me, like dismissing my mother at a wine dinner, to not include them in everything that I say about the work that we do, because they never farmed the way that I farm until we started Hopewell. And it was a real learning curve for all of us together, and talking about it with language barriers, and me trying to learn enough technical Spanish to be able to talk about microorganisms and all of that stuff. But the depth of creativity that is locked up inside people who use their hands every day and see the same plants. I mean, it's like there is such a wealth of experience and appreciation, and they're great tasters. They're great companions, and I think they would only make the wine story richer. And that's why I just think, every time I go to a wine dinner now, I'm just like appalled. And it's not like I want to just be one of those people who throws Molotov cocktails into everybody's good time, but it is it is one of those things where I think until we start making some really uncomfortable situations, it's never going to get comfortable. Like we're never going to get there. We can Instagram all the black screens and all the things that we want to do to
Hmm.
feel a little bit better, but putting those people in front of us, like in front, they lead. That's that's where it really starts to change.
Have you, do you, I've seen a couple things that I thought were really good steps in the right direction, like sort of like winery partnerships to be able to provide permanent jobs and benefits for vineyard workers instead of just having these sort of seasonal migrant, that idea, that idea of just temporary workers. I've seen things where people do. Yeah, I like the idea of cross training. Yeah,
Hmm.
vineyard and cellar.
Hmm.
Get people who are in the vineyard into the cellar, and into the cellar out into the vineyard, and make it one staff instead of two separate staffs. Um, and then, yeah, I don't know, anything else any practical things that you've seen or ideas that you've seen that are steps in the right direction.
Well, for sure. I mean, for sure, the model of vigneron is the model that is the most egalitarian. Where if you think you're good enough to make wine, grow the fruit first, right? I mean, not
Right.
that everybody can do that, and I know that that's a very bold statement, but I think that if you aren't willing to go out and work in the field, then you probably don't know enough about the grapes. And that's about willingness. It's not about knowledge. It's just about what you think your job is. Because there's a model where the knowledge that it takes to really shepherd something into an art form requires an intimacy that can't just start at the winery door. And we're stepping over like the most critical piece of information that's all locked up in the hands of these people that do all the work in the vineyard, and then they're left out of the winery. And so that for sure the bringing in to the cellar, because the flow of work is perfectly aligned for that. When harvest is over, the wine needs to be made. Those people should not just get laid off. They should go work in the winery, and then also not just clean stuff. I mean, they should
Right.
be they should be sitting down at the tasting table. They should be sitting down at the blending table. It's a very I think anybody who's worked in a cellar and kind of taught people in a cellar can value what it means. And the same is true in the vineyard. When you teach someone something, you learn it better yourself. And when you repeatedly do that, I mean, that there's mastery, and it's never mastery, but you always get better when you're teaching. And so I
Yeah.
think I mean, the idea that we're not just using people, but that we're training and shoring up and elevating, and always assuming that we're not the last step in the road for this person, that they have maybe something truly great in front of them, maybe their own wine brand, maybe they'll become a teacher, maybe they'll start their own management company or whatever. But I think that's the opportunity has to be put in front of them much, much more often. And I think that being in the winery more does make for better viticulture. It makes for better winemaking. I think it's all that, just the fact that so many of them never have tasted a wine that came from the work that they've done is so wow.
I mean,
It's
it seems
yeah.
like that's the most obvious thing to improve quality. Like,
Yeah.
if you're not invested in the end product, how can you care as much? How can
Right.
you do your best work? I don't know, just for practical reasons. It seems like if you take away all the other reasons, if you were just purely a mercenary and wanted to, make better wine, it seems obvious that that would be one step in the direction of quality that you could take.
First, I mean, it
Um,
is the lowest hanging fruit. It really is. I
Yeah.
mean, if you want somebody to appreciate what your expectations are in the winery when you are trying to make something, the wine that's in your heart, the only way to imbue that in another person is to bring them into your process and say,
Yeah.
and have them really live it with you, like gut it out on the sorting table, with the minutia of like berry sorting. That changes the way that you see the vine. I mean, it totally does, and vice versa.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I think that's huge.
Maybe do you want to put anything out there in terms of your website or any resources that you would like to promote or anything like that?
Well, that's very nice of you to ask. I mean, we can,
Are you
obviously
writing?
we.
God forbid. I,
Yeah.
I wish more work on a farmer, but I think you should write a book.
That's very kind of you to say. Currently, no, I don't know when but I do write a lot, and I'm about to. There's, my blog posts are always like longer than a blog post has any right being, and so we're trying to think of new platforms for when people really want to get super technical and weird about some of these concepts and ideas, where they can, go to read a whole lot more. So I have been writing a lot more. I'm definitely not in a position to write a book right now, but yeah, the website is Hopewell Wine. There is another Hopewell Winery, so don't search for Hopewell Winery unless you want to meet those people. I'm sure they're very lovely. We've never met in person, but I believe it's in Virginia. And I think mostly though, I encourage everyone to seek out more people like you, more people who are wanting to have more important conversations about wine than just, whatever's swirling in the glass, which is really entertaining and I do enjoy doing that. But I think that right now we need to scale up the way that we're talking about ag, about food production, about human beings working. And I appreciate what you're doing. And I think it was a real honor to talk to you today.
That's very kind. Thank you. It was a real honor to talk to you as well. I appreciate it. And yeah, I hope we can do this again soon.
Yeah, I hope we can.